Welcome, folks. We're glad you're here for this evening's presentation on best financial practices, or as we've also called it, tending the treasure. We ask, as you come on board, we'd love to see your lovely faces, but if you would, just keep your microphones muted so we can focus our attention on our presenters this evening. So welcome one and all. We're going to take another minute or two to welcome folks in. I'm Pastor Michael Jeanette, and I serve as assistant to the bishop for formation and communication in the Southeastern Synod. We'll be recording this evening so that you can review the materials covered this evening, and you'll also get a copy of the slides presented as a PDF. So our ELCA Treasurers team is here and ready to move forward, but just going to give about 5 or 10 more seconds to get a couple more people in, and then I'll get us kicked off here. We thank you all for making time tonight to join together. We have about 350 people registered for this event. So we have folks from all across the ELCA. Okay. We are recording, so just another reminder that's happening. And again, another reminder, we'd love to see your faces if possible. So we'd love to have the cameras on. And we'll have the microphones muted for the evening. We will have a time at the end of our session, which runs 1 hour in length. We're running from 7 to 8 Eastern time. I'll let you do the math to figure out what time zone you're in. But we'll be together here for the next hour. And welcome you one and all. We at the Southeastern Synod are proud to share ministry together in this way with many different organizations, ministries, congregations, synods, and with the ELCA. And so tonight, just wanted to take a moment to introduce our main presenter, Lori Fedyk. And hope I'm pronouncing that right, Lori Fedyk. Yes. Okay. Lori Fedyk, a member of Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Libertyville, Illinois, serves as treasurer of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, elected to a 6-year term by the ELCA Church Council in November 2017, and began her term February 1, 2018. Prior to joining the ELCA as treasurer, Lori was employed by Lutheran Life Communities in Arlington Heights, Illinois, where she served as executive vice president and chief financial officer. Lutheran Life Communities owns and operates continuing care retirement communities in Illinois and Indiana, and Lori currently serves as a member of the board of directors and is chair of the Audit, Risk, and Investment Committee. Lori, we still have about 10 people coming in, so I'm going to continue to let people in, but would love to turn this over to you and your team so we can get started this evening. So Lori.
All right, thank you so much. Good evening. Thank you, Pastor Jeanette. Thank you to Bishop Strickland for the invitation to gather with all of you. And most of all, thank you for each of you and for the many ways that you serve this church, including as congregational treasurers. So thank you for joining us tonight. We come together recognizing that it's likely that every person on this call has a uniquely different situation. But what we hope to do is to share some best practices and basic principles that will be helpful to you as you carry out your individual responsibilities. Having said that, you'll see at the end, we've got an email address, ot.info@elca.org, and you're always welcome to email us. That email is manned, and we send it around to the right people that can help you out and answer questions as we can. So certainly we encourage you tonight to put any questions or comments in the chat. We'll try to address as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. And if there's some that we don't get to, we will work with Pastor Jeanette and identify a way to provide more answers to those questions. So again, I serve as the treasurer of the ELCA, and the other 2 individuals from the Office of the Treasurer that have joined this evening will be introducing themselves at their respective sessions. So just to begin, one of the things, as I said in the beginning, is not only is each congregation's situation uniquely different, but probably the role of the treasurer in each individual congregation varies from one to another. But I wanted to provide a little bit of background on the role of the treasurer as laid out in the Model Constitution for Congregations in Chapter 11.01. So the specific duties of the congregation treasurer are generally outlined in the bylaws of the Constitution and should be reviewed regularly. For example, my congregation is actually going to be voting on ours the first week of November, and some of those changes relate to the role of the treasurer versus our business office staff, and just some changes that we've made in that area. So much of what we're going to talk about this evening, I think sometimes feels like difficult conversations. In many congregations, this work is done by volunteers. There's some office staff, but sometimes it's easily either misconstrued or misunderstood by some that we're putting these procedures in place because we don't trust people, or that we're worried about fraud. And the reality of it is we don't suspect anyone not to be trustworthy, but even the most well-intended people make errors. Items can slip through the cracks and go unnoticed if the proper controls are not in place. And the other piece about this is a strong internal control environment with checks and balances will give donors more confidence, protects the congregation's pastor, employees, as well as volunteers, because there are processes in place. So ensuring your constitution has term limits for your treasurer is a key internal control. As a general rule, the church council will have the responsibility for financial and related property matters, but the treasurer should play a critical role in ensuring these internal controls and policy and procedures are in place, and to make sure that the church council is equipped with good financial statements to aid them in their decision making. The next slide lists some of those key tasks, and we're going to talk about many of these tasks this evening. Things like the budget, the monthly financial statements, policies, unrestricted versus restricted accounts, gift acceptance, cash handling. All of those things are things that are generally, they look to the treasurer to set the tone for those. One of the other things I wanted to share with you, if you are not familiar with resourceful servants, and so if you can advance that, Stephanie, please. If you are not familiar with resourceful servants, I want to take this opportunity to introduce you to the program. Resourceful Servants is an initiative which aims to promote financial wellness of ELCA congregations, rostered ministers, and seminarians. And it's a partnership between the churchwide organization, the Mission Investment Fund of the ELCA Federal Credit Union, the Foundation, Portico Benefit Services, and Lutheran Social Services Financial Counseling. And funding for part of this work was provided from the Lilly Endowment Fund. So you may be asking, how is this helpful for me as a congregational treasurer? Well, one of the tools within Resourceful Servants is the creation of a congregational financial assessment. And this tool helps congregations analyze their practices around the following topics: accounting, finance, human resources, risk management, and stewardship. And when you go to this site, under each of these categories is guidance to help improve your operations in each of these areas. The good news is the tool is free, and it's available to any congregation that files a parochial report with the churchwide organization. And the PIN number you use to file that parochial report is the PIN number that you use to register your congregation for this. So this is a great way to identify congregations' strengths and opportunities related to financial matters. If we talk about separation of duties, or also you may have heard it called segregation of duties. This is an important internal control in any financial operation, nonprofits, for-profits, etc. And the concept is that by limiting the duties of various individuals, the risk of theft or undetected mistakes is mitigated. So regardless of the size of your staff or volunteers in the financial area, recognizing that we have to be reasonable, and we have to also realize that many congregations are small and don't have a large staff. But what is most important in the segregation of duties is to look at three areas really. One being who is authorizing the transaction, who is recording the transaction in the books and records, and who has custody of the assets that can affect making disbursements or recording cash receipts, the handling of cash receipts. And as a general rule, it's okay to have one person do two of these three: authorization, recording, and custody, but they shouldn't have access to be able to do all three. But if you have two, you're usually pretty safe. One of the other best practices, and again, I recognize this is sometimes hard in a congregation where you don't have a large staff, but often what happens when people take vacation is the work piles up until they come back. And then when they come back from vacation, they continue along and try to catch up. Where it's possible, it's really a good best practice if someone else steps in and does that work during the time that the regularly assigned person would be on vacation. And there's really a couple of reasons for that. One is it allows for some cross-training and someone else to become familiar with other processes. And secondly, it's really a deterrent control in the internal control environment, because if someone were tempted to try to perpetrate the system, this would be assigned to them, that someone else would be in their records and have access, and it might be detected. So it is somewhat of a deterrent control. The next slide includes a few examples of functions that should involve more than one person. And as you look within the operations of your own congregation, I think what's helpful is to do a step-by-step walkthrough of the people, the processes you have in place to handle receipts, to make payments, and to enter data into your system. And during this, if you're mindful of who is authorizing the transaction, who is recording it, and who has custody, you may identify places that you want to reconfigure the process. And another thing, one thing that I think congregations find helpful is that there are definitely tasks that need to be done by a trained financial person, often an accountant, and hopefully someone that has some accounting training. But there's also tasks that can be done by other volunteers in the congregation. And so it's important to try to segregate out those things that someone that's less technical, maybe it's about counting offering, maybe it's about making deposits or reviewing the check register, things like that, that you can train someone how to do that and they don't have to have an accounting background. So I'm now going to turn it over to Stephanie, and she will cover some of this in more detail.
Hi, good evening. I'm Stephanie Alba, and I am the controller at the ELCA. I'm happy to be with you for this evening, and we'll be presenting a handful of slides, starting with the safeguarding of our offerings. So when we do those Sunday collections or any other special collections, there's a couple of great controls to have in place just to help protect those assets. So it's a great opportunity to always have dual custody at all times of those cash and checks that we have coming in. So having more than one person at all times with their hands on those funds. And at the same time, we don't want to keep using the same two individuals to count that cash. So whenever, if we can kind of rotate through those individuals that are counting, just to be able to give the opportunity to other individuals and make sure that the process isn't contained within the same subset of people. Once the cash is counted, the best practice is to deposit that cash immediately after counting, just to ensure that it is, going directly to our bank account and available for us to use. We do recognize that sometimes with the Sunday service, it might not be as feasible to deposit that cash right away. So we would recommend to count the cash and checks right after collection and keep a log of that count sheet, and then have an independent party outside of the bookkeeper or accounting team to make that deposit. And then at the end, we could always reconcile those two amounts together when we're doing that monthly bank reconciliation, to make sure that the cash that was given is what was deposited, and ultimately that it has reached that bank account. Whenever those deposits are made, we'd recommend to keep those copies of the deposit slips and give them to the treasurer or the financial secretary for that reconciliation process. And then we have the regular reporting of those offerings to our members, likely on a quarterly basis. But then we do want to maintain the confidentiality of our offerings to those that would have a need to know, most likely the pastor, financial secretary, and stewardship committee. In addition to cash and check offerings, I know there's been a big shift into online giving tools. And while that is also a great platform and a nice organized way to bring in our giving, there's another potential for some control considerations. So when we are receiving those gifts through whatever online giving tool your organization happens to be using, we want to set up a reconciliation process to ensure that those gifts are properly deposited. If the donor is giving a gift for a specific intent, that we have a way to track that when we're moving those gifts from our online system into our accounting system, so that we are, intending to honor that donor intent, and that we're continuing to track that through the life of the gift and the use of that gift. Along with the segregation or separation of duties that Lori was discussing, we will want to continue to have that separation of duties around the online giving process, and having a review of those that have access to the online banking system and the online giving provider to ensure that we are following that good, strong control environment. And then finally, we'd want to monitor our budgets and just make sure that there aren't any unusual giving trends that are coming through. Sometimes that budget to actual reporting is a great opportunity just to make sure that everything is moving in the way that we would expect it to. And if there are any anomalies that come up, we'd recommend to follow up to make sure that everything is okay there. There are two online giving tools that the ELCA has agreements with. They are Tithely and Vanco. We have the QR code on the screen here, and the link also available in the slides that we will be sharing. These are fast, easy, secure, very convenient tools to use, and we do have a special pricing available. So all of that is shared within our ELCA website on the different opportunities that both Tithely and Vanco offer. So something to consider if you're not already using that. Moving on to fund accounting, I alluded to the different gifts that we may get, especially the online gifts or a special collection that comes through. So there's varying funds that we would typically report on. For financial reporting purposes, there's really just two key funds. The unrestricted funds, those that are general operating, available for our use in any means that we need, and then those that are restricted very much from our donors. So those that are giving those gifts to the congregations for a specific intent, we want to keep those restricted and ensure that we are using those gifts only for the intent that they've been given. However, the church is commonly using additional funds in our regular course of business just to help us in tracking how we're going to spend our money and make sure that we have those funds available for the initiatives and needs that we have. So a few examples are on the screen here. The designated fund is an opportunity for us to set aside dollars if we have something that we need to spend some money on, but we haven't had a donor specifically tell us that they want the funds spent there. We could set that aside in a bucket and use it for that purpose. Those for financial reporting purposes fall within the unrestricted fund, but it's just a nice way for us internally to be able to track how we are going to use those funds in the future. Property, plant, and equipment also is another unrestricted fund, but it's a nice way to monitor your capital purchases and any spending that you have related to fixed assets, depreciation, those types of things within the congregation. Temporarily restricted are those funds that come in with a restriction that we will be fulfilling. So it may be a time restriction, it may be a specific use restriction. So we call them temporarily restricted in the fact that eventually that restriction will be alleviated and those funds will be used for that purpose. And then finally, there's the permanently restricted funds, and those are the endowments that come through to the congregations. Those funds then would have a permanent restriction for their use. We recognize that some congregations may have those, and there is an opportunity for congregations to invest their endowments with the ELCA. So then next, I'm going to go through the designated and restricted gifts. The key thing here is to always keep the restricted gifts aside in our bank accounts. I know that cash comes in and it's all probably in one account in one fund, but it's important that we don't spend those restricted gifts on operating items, so that those gifts will always be available to be used for the specific intent of the donor. So when we do receive those, it's important to try to keep that separate accounting and tracking from those undesignated gifts so that we know what our operating funds are that are available to be used. And as we have on the slide here, to maintain that sufficient bank balance to cover any designated and restricted funds that have not been used yet for that purpose, so they continue to be available for that use that the donor intends. It's really key that we honor that donor intent and that we have a general policy for circumstances when a purpose can't be fulfilled. If we were to receive a gift that's for a very specific purpose that the congregation knows is just not going to be realistic to use in that way, there is the right to refuse those gifts and to let the donor know that that intent would not be able to be honored, and it's best to just give those gifts back to that donor. And finally, if the congregation were to have any grants come through, there's a lot of additional reporting that comes through there. So it's key that we track our use of those grants and that we're using them for that use that's established in the grant. If we were to not honor the intent of the grant, there's always the risk that the grantor could call those funds back. So another great reason just to keep those gifts very independently tracked. And then finally, I'm going to speak through the expenditures side of the house. So we talked through the giving, but now for how we are going to spend those funds. And whenever we have expenses coming through the congregations, a key way to save some money is to avoid sales tax by using our exemption letters. And then when we are reimbursing or paying for any types of goods or services that we are going to have at the congregation, it's really key to use some form of a standard voucher or expense form, just to keep a really consistent tracking mechanism in place. And if we ever were to be audited, then it'll be a nice record keeping system to go back to. So when we have those expenses, ensure that there's written approval and support for the payments to get reimbursed. And then we can consider whether it's appropriate to use an electronic billing or payments system for those different types of expenses that we have coming through, especially if it's a recurring, very standard type of payment that the organization is seeing on a monthly basis. And then if the congregation does have petty cash, I think the main key here is just to keep that safeguarded and counted regularly, so that we know what cash there is at the office, and that if we do use it, that it gets accounted for within our records. So then best practices for checks and signatures and kind of in relation to those expenditures is it's really a best practice to have dual signatures. So have two individuals signing off on every check and expenditure that is going to leave the office. As a backup plan, it's a great idea to have a third authorized signer in place, just so that you're not only relying on two individuals, and if one individual is unexpectedly out, then you're unable to pay your bills for that week or that amount of time. Additionally, we wouldn't want the bookkeeper to sign checks just because of the reconciliation process that bookkeeper is involved in. So to keep the, just to keep the custody of the checkbook, keep it in a secure location. Blank check stock, we wouldn't want to have available for anyone to fill out or sign. So to have that in a restricted place as well. And as a general term, don't write checks to cash, because then there isn't that good tracking mechanism of what we paid for. And even just for reconciliation purposes, it's really helpful to be able to go back and see who we wrote those checks to and what's their intended uses for those. And then for reimbursement, for those that are spending funds on behalf of the organization, we can determine what the best practice is. Do we want to have an expense allowance for that individual, or reimburse on an expense by expense specific purpose? So to do this, we'd recommend to have a budget and create a timing cutoff for those expense reimbursements. 30 days is a great rule of practice. It aligns with very likely when that individual's credit card statement is coming through, and when they're going to need to pay those fees. And then it also keeps the church's books accurate and timely, so that there's no unexpected expenses that come through maybe 2 or 3 months after they've been expended. In order to be reimbursed kind of along with that standard voucher or expense form, have a documentation provided that shows the purpose and original receipts for those expenditures. And if you are providing a cash advance to help cover future costs for an event or something where it would be burdensome to the individual for them to spend it out of their own funds at first, still have a reconciliation and substantiation of the payment process in place, so that you can see where those funds were expended and what they were used for that specific purpose or event. And then under reimbursement, there is no need to report this on a W-2. It's strictly expenses that were expended on behalf of the church that got reimbursed. So no income implications for that. And then the congregation would retain ownership of all purchases that are made. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Santiago.
Sorry, I'm muted. How often do we do that? Santiago Padilla, I'm Director for Budget Planning. I'm glad to be here, and I hope that the material that we're presenting provides you some that's a good tool that you can use in your day-to-day work, at least as a general guideline, as Lori has mentioned. How to worker classification guidelines. This is an area that that often has the categorization is done incorrectly. It's estimated that around 30% of companies label employees as independent contractors, and vice versa. So this slide will kind of help us go through some of the rules, right, on how to do that. And one of the biggest things is who has it's really related to control. Who controls the work that the person is doing? If it's this first bullet point says you have to determine the difference between an independent contractor and an employee, and that has, again, I know I'm repeating myself, has to do with who controls the work. A contractor, so there's a common law rule, and that's these 3 bullet points, and it's behavioral. financial, and the type of relationship. So behavioral would be, does the company control the work that is being done? Does the employee direct and control how the work is performed? The employer, I mean. If yes, then the worker is an employee. On the financial control, does the employer rightfully control the worker's finances, or provide a computer, provide the equipment and the place to do the work? If so, then they're an employee. And the relationship, is determined based on the nature and the term of the contract. So if you pay sick time, if you pay benefits, if you provide a pension, then that person would be an employee. There's another rule, and it's called the ABC test, and that's 3 factors, and it's absence of control, the business nature, and and how's the worker customarily engaged. So if the worker is free from direction or control from the employer, then this person is an independent contractor. If the worker is performing the work, it's unusual and unrelated to the employer's trade, then yes, this is a contractor. Is the worker customarily engaged in their own line of business, so they're independent of the employer? If so, then they are also an independent contractor. And then, of course, clergy has dual status. They're an employee for federal withholdings, and they're self-employed for Social Security and Medicare. One other thing to consider, and I'll provide the resource. It's helpful to know how states have different ways to look at worker classifications. So some states use the common law rules, and other states use the ABC test. So I'll provide that guidance on that, so that you can kind of get an idea of how your particular state handles it. And since let's see, Southwest would be, well, I'm not going to get into that. If it's, I'm going to assume that you guys are in Georgia, but you're probably in other states. So I'm going to just skip. Okay, next slide, please. Housing allowance. Housing allowance is excluded from federal income tax. It's established annually before the start of the year. What we do at Churchwide is our human resource department reaches out to our pastors and asks them what they'll be using as a housing allowance, and that's what's entered into the payroll system. It's generally approved in congregations, it's generally approved by church council, and it applies to ordained or commissioned ministers, those who administer sacraments and conduct worship. The allowable expenses are mortgage, rent, real estate, property insurance, utilities, repairs, remodel, and maintenance. So I know I kind of went through this fairly fast, but go ahead, next slide. This is a continuation. Also the amount of fair market value, actual expenses, as long as it's less than the amount previously designated. And then finally, the Churchwide organization's position on deacons. We do not take a position on whether deacons are eligible for housing allowance. We can't give legal or tax advice on this, and we recommend that you discuss with your local the pastor, discuss it with local tax preparer or legal counsel. And that decision is between the individual, the congregation, and the tax preparer and the IRS. Next slide. Budgets. There's a number of different types of budgets you can utilize. What we've got listed here are 5 or 6 of the most common ones, or those that you would use on an annual basis. You don't have to use, you can choose one versus another. You may have one for presentations and one to do your that's actually in your system. So zero-based budget is a way to look at it and say, you know, we're starting new each year. We're going to substantiate every line item in our budget, and that's a good way to look at past practices versus what you're anticipating on spending. Because what I've noticed is that people just keep that budget static, and they don't necessarily look at line item by line item. They'll generally just take an approach that's, let's take next year and last year's and make some adjustments. A narrative budget is a more descriptive budget, so it aligns a narrative view with your strategic priorities of the organization, of the congregation. It's a way to highlight certain aspects, and it should be supported by a numerical budget. Next slide. Same as last year budget is basically what I said earlier, is you take last year's budget and you just make tweaks in either a percentage increase across the board or tweaks between programs. Capital budget is a way for you to budget those improvements that you plan to do to your congregation. It could be office equipment, furniture and fixture, construction, or additional capital outlays. Program budget is very similar to a narrative budget. It's just laid out by program, right? So the program specific. You still have line items, but it's more bucketed by the type of activity that you're going to handle. And then debt retirement budget. In general, you should have a plan on how you plan to repay your long-term debt. Yeah, thank you. Data issues. So this is the data security. As we've noted, people are the best security, but also can be the weakest link. So you need to ensure that your employees are well versed in maintaining and safeguarding personal information and congregational information. Ensure that you have adequate IT security for cloud, internet, email, and this includes virus scans, firewalls, and strong passwords as you're able, right? And we know that this is expensive, but there are tools out there that are not expensive and allows you to ensure that your your network is secure. Install antivirus or malware software, anti-spyware on your laptops, servers, and keep up with your regular updates, especially those that come from big companies like Apple and Microsoft. While it may seem that that those expenses come across every year, you need to update your software, but it really safeguards your data, because a lot of times the reason why they do regular updates is somebody's identified a weakness in a platform, and the larger companies are typically better at maintaining those regular updates. If you have an iPhone, you know that happens, probably once a month, if not once every other month, that you have to do an update. Ensure electronic data is regularly backed up, either physically or to a cloud device. Okay, you can go to the next slide. I think it continues. Ensure access to data is commensurate with duties. So review who should have access to data and who shouldn't have access. So some data restrictions are best practice. Review users regularly, and and if at all possible, use encryption to store and transmit sensitive information. I know that Microsoft has some pretty good encryption stuff out there for email. If you're going to be sending email out, they have an encryption feature. Require strong passwords. Also, make sure people don't share passwords, or I know it's not written on here, but don't use Post-its, and keep a password underneath a keyboard. I've seen that in the past where people would just keep a well, when Rolodexes were a thing, people would put their passwords in a Rolodex, but yeah, that's not a good practice. If possible, use multi-factor authentication. That's becoming a bigger thing. A text message that follows when you log in, and then you usually get a password, and then you reset it. Or you validate that it truly is you or the user that's trying to get into your systems. And then be diligent with handling personally identifiable information, names and addresses, social security numbers, credit card information, bank card information, documents with any financial information. And a lot of systems now have it where, like, social security numbers will only show the last 4 digits. So keep that in mind as if you have accounting systems. There's typically the more modern ones or the newer ones. With payroll systems, you can truncate that or hide the first digits, and you just show the last 4. So that's good practice, if at all, if you can do that. And I think now I'm going to turn it back to Lori.
Thanks, Santiago.
Yeah.
Yeah, the last slide I want to cover here is just one of the key internal controls that healthy congregations have in place is the conduct of an annual audit. Now, this can take a couple of different forms, and I saw a question in the chat about how often should you have a real audit done by an outside firm. And what I would tell you is I'm not aware that a lot of our congregations do an external audit where they opine on the accuracy of your financial statements. Synods are required to have an audit done, but I don't believe a lot of our congregations have an external audit. The challenge with that is because it's something that you really have to do every year, because the starting point for the auditor is to take your balance sheet and your equity as it stands, or your net assets at the beginning, and then test all the activity for the current year to opine on the ending balance. And so the challenge with that is if they haven't tested the prior year, they don't have a starting point, which is what makes it difficult unless you can have an audit done annually. And so I think that's why most congregations shift to doing more of a procedural and internal audit type. And there's a lot of things that can be done on an internal audit, in terms of reviewing online offerings for accuracy. Does the amount that is reported by the online company compare to what was deposited at the bank? And does that compare to the giving records and the detail of deposits by members? Some congregations will send out a confirmation to a sample of members saying, is this accurate? Is this really what you gave this year? This is what's reflected in the records. You can look at a sample of gifts and make sure that they were properly recorded between unrestricted and restricted by looking at the documentation. Selecting a sample of disbursements to make sure that the expense was properly recorded in the general ledger, that there was proper documentation, a contract or an invoice, that it was approved for payment, the check signers are accurate. If there's supposed to be multiple check signers, that it was signed by multiple people that are authorized with the bank. And then the check cleared the bank. Another procedure is to look at the numeric sequence of checks that were issued during the year and understand if there were voided checks or gaps in the sequence. Where are those checks that are missing? Looking at bank reconciliations to make sure they were performed on a monthly basis and that the amount on the books can be reconciled to the bank statement. The same way on investments or endowments that you may have, taking those and tracing them back to the source documents. Because most of the assets of a church are either in their building and property or it's in financial assets, cash and investments. Looking at your paychecks to make sure that the rate that is in the system, there's support for the hours worked. If it's an hourly employee, that tax forms are on file, support for withholdings, etc. So these are some of the things that can be done on a procedural audit. And, you know, it's a best practice to do this. There is a form on elca.org that documents different ideas on this and some process. We are actually in the process of reviewing and updating some of these, but the core of what is in there will remain largely consistent. So that's a resource you can look at. And this is also, I talked earlier about resourceful servants, the initiative. And one of the best practices there is that you do an operational audit on an annual basis. So the other thing we've done is we have listed the resources to some of the materials that are available. And, you know, we'll continue to update resources and share with you. Again, if there's something that's missing, I saw somebody ask about in-kind, a form for in-kind gifts. We have guidance on in-kind gifts, but it's a narrative. So I will do some more checking on that. If we do not have a form, I am happy to work on putting a form together and putting it out there on elca.org under the financial resources. So those questions are really helpful, and we are happy to provide materials for that. So again, I want to just say thank you for participating. We can go through some. I've tried to answer a few questions that have come up. But some were maybe better left to be discussed. So if Michael, if it's okay with you, we'll just go back through some of those questions and try to provide some responses to those. Does that work?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. It was a great presentation, great resource. To start off with, some questions with so much online giving happening, there were some questions around like people using something like Zelle or Venmo. Can you provide any guidance as to if that's a good practice or not? I know there's things like Banco and Tidely that you mentioned, but what about other things like Venmo, PayPal, etc.?
I think the most important things with any of those sites are to make sure that the sites are secure and that you have transparency to what was given and who it was given from, because you're going to need to record that in the giving records. So I think any of those tools, I'm not aware of any reasons why those are not good tools to use. I think the Vanco and Tidely option is that they are specifically designed for nonprofit, specifically designed for congregational type giving. And so it may be better geared toward that.
Thank you. There was a question about, template for in-kind giving. I think you mentioned you're going to work on, or did you mention that? I'm sorry.
Yes,
in-kind giving.
We will look for a form or try to put together a form. I do not know that there's one out there. I know there's guidance in the resources. If you go to elca.org and you just type in-kind gifts, you can see some of the guidance on that. But I don't know that there's a form out there. And so that's something we'd need to put together.
Thank you. Just looking at more things here. There's some people have mentioned moving monies around into, say, different types of savings accounts, some short-term CDs, things of this nature. Is there guidance around using, moving dollars sort of from one bucket to another within your own organization to take advantage of some accounts that have higher interest rates than, say, something like a savings account?
Yeah, I think, it's certainly a good idea, especially in the market that we have right now, that if you can capture some of the favorable interest rates, I think it's important to understand if it's FDIC insured. That is certainly one thing to consider. Also, the ease of transferring money and to look at your cash flow as a congregation. I saw some data a few years ago that basically reflected it, and I think it's changed a little bit with a shift toward online giving. But what this statistic showed was that many congregations are only cash positive a couple of months of the year. And so, if you have those spikes in giving, it's important that you can easily access the funds, and that you do some projections, on your cash flows to make sure that you don't lock money up longer than where you're going to need to get to the next peak, if you're in a valley. So, but as I said, I think that has started to level out a little bit more with online giving, as people will put in something at the beginning of the year and give that whether they are in worship or not in person.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a couple more
Stephanie and
minutes.
Santiago, feel
Oh,
free to jump
sorry.
in if you have anything to add to these.
Somebody, I think this will be help somebody kind of rest easy. If you would answer this one, you kind of went over this already, but we currently do not take federal tax out of our pastor's pay. Should we be doing that?
So for pastors, their pastors have the oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. I'm sorry.
Schedule C, is that kind of what you're referring to?
Yeah, so I guess so you do not
Self-employment
take it
tax.
out, and is that at the request of the pastor? Is that what you're saying?
This was Carolyn.
I'm looking for this question.
Dual
Yeah,
tax status?
Dual tax status.
So typically they're
Yes, they do have dual tax. Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
yeah, no, I was going to say they're employees for federal withholdings, and they're self-employed for Social Security and Medicare. So they pay the full 15% of Social Security and Medicare. And my understanding that at least at church-wide, we withhold Social Security from all of our ordained pastors.
We do. I'm just trying to see what the question, if the person is out there and wants to ask the question.
Here, I'll paste it again, but if you're there, Carolyn, you can unmute yourself and feel free to share. I just repasted the question at the bottom.
Okay, this is Carolyn. I'm here.
Hey,
So
would you like to
we,
speak to the question?
We pay pastor through, we use paychecks, and he gets all his money cash, and then he's always been considered self-employed. But it looks like from the slide that was presented, perhaps we should be taking federal taxes out. I don't know if he asked for that. It was ongoing before he got there. I think that's how we did it with our first pastor, and just continued that practice with our current pastor.
It seems like to me they are setting up for, maybe it's through their self-employment that they are paying quarterly. And if they're doing quarterly estimates, they are covering their federal tax obligation. I would like to look into that more, though.
Yeah, I'm wondering if do you issue them a 1099? That would be the other way where they'd be considered an independent contractor. And then they'd be responsible for paying their own taxes.
I've been the treasurer for 3 years and he's never asked for one. So I guess
Okay.
that would be no. So will someone get back with, how will I get an answer to that?
Yeah, we can take that down and get back to you with why they may not be doing that, because I would say that's not typical.
Okay,
So this is their federal taxes that they don't have withheld.
we withhold nothing.
Okay,
The amount due to him, each paycheck is put into the paycheck system and he gets that full amount.
yeah, certainly they are responsible for the 17.5% self-employment tax. But I need to, I just want to look into that.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's some comments coming in from some of the community here saying W-2 is issued, but there are no federal taxes withheld from those from those pastors' payroll. But I'm not the expert. I'm just your lovely host for the evening. So
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately they have to pay their taxes, and if they're doing quarterly estimates, they're covering it that way. It just, is a cash flow difference. So, it's probably fine. But I think that they have to recognize, if you were to get a new pastor, I would think that that would be something you'd want to discuss with them to make sure that they recognize and, consult with their tax advisor that what that would, or their tax preparer, what that means for their cash flow and how it works.
Yeah, I've heard a previous employer, and I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but we had an employee who would claim like, I don't know, 20 dependents. So what that would do is drive his withholdings down to nothing, but then he would do quarterly payments. So again, like you said, Lori, it's more of a cash flow thing.
Right, right.
So we have time for maybe one or two more questions, but I will reassure everyone that we are recording tonight. We'll share that recording. We'll share the slides as well. And then I'll be in communication with Lori and her team and get some of these questions that are kind of still hanging out there. We'll do our best to pull those together, either to refer you back to the ELCA website or include something in a follow-up email as well. So we'll do our best to answer those questions. We'll save the chat so that we have all these things. Sherry has raised their hand. So Sherry, I think you might be the last question for the evening. So please unmute and share. Sherry, you are muted. Feel free to unmute and share.
There we go.
Thank you. Oh, I wonder if it's if there's more than one Sherry, but my question, I'm Sherry Trent. My question would be, will you have examples of reports that go to the whole congregation? I have a system for the monthly reports to the congregate or to the council, but I'd be interested in best practices for reporting. Could we have another class on that sometime? Sharing information with people.
Sure. We can certainly help you with some ideas and examples. I think what in my mind, transparency is the most important. So if you're getting pushback that someone doesn't want to share, that's usually a concern. For me, it would be a concern. Obviously, the congregation doesn't need to see every dollar that's spent, but they need to understand in a meaningful way where the dollars are being spent, because the more people are comfortable, the more they're likely to support the work that you're doing. So, but we can certainly try to pull together some examples for you.
So Sherry Oswald was the one who had raised hand. Let's
Right.
take that as our last question. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. My question is, do we, whether we're a treasurer or whether we're on council, should we have any kind of liability protection for our people in terms of, I don't know, a congregant that gets upset with how things are being handled, attempts to sue one of us or something along those lines?
I would recommend that most congregations should carry directors and officers insurance that would cover those individuals. And, certainly if you work with Church Mutual, I'm sure they can provide some guidance in that area. But I think it's always a wise practice.
Thank you.
Good one to end on. I feel sorry for Diane, who's just now signing in and may have a time zone incorrect. We appreciate you, Lori and Santiago and Stephanie, for presentation this evening. Here in the Southeastern Synod, we're happy to host these types of, we've done all kinds of things, formation, administration, treasurer-based, all kinds of functions to help us to be effective in how we manage our congregations, how we work with our congregations to support best practices across the board. Obviously, our goal is to share the gospel with all so that, and if we're doing these practices in the best way possible, we're using those to God's glory, using those resources to God's glory. So just to bring that back into focus, that's why we're here. A lot of these practices are really just to make sure that we are honoring the gifts that God has first given us. And when our congregational members give to congregation synods or churchwide, that we honor that the best we can. I'll be happy to close us out with a word of prayer and bid us into a good evening. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Also with you.
Gracious God, we give you thanks for helping us to tend the treasure that you have first given us. Obviously our time and our talents, but also the treasures that you've bestowed upon us. We ask now that you guide us into a restful evening. We give you thanks for those who have been equipped to help serve in this capacity to guide all of us here this evening. We thank you for Stephanie, for Santiago and Lori, that they might continue to be faithful witnesses and servants in your church here in the ELCA. Help us now to take this, process this, and in the days to come, as we receive these resources, put them into use in our congregations and synods across the ELCA. Thank you again, Lord, for this time together, that we might learn from one another. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all, Lori, Santiago, Stephanie. Y'all can show your appreciation with some applause and Thanksgiving in the chat as well. So thank you all. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, you all have a restful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.